Welcome to Active Shooter, the podcast.
After decades now of mass shootings, we haven't found the answer.
A tribute to the victims of two mass shootings.
Thank you for listening to Active Shooter, the podcast.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning. On the island of Tasmania, the worst massacre in Australian history is finally over. At least 34 people were killed and 4 others critically wounded when a 29-year-old gunman with a history of mental problems opened fire in a popular tourist area. The carnage came to an end only this morning after the gunman caught fire following a 12-hour standoff with police. He's alive and in custody today, Monday, April the 29th, 1996.
Port Arthur, Tasmania, Australia, was a town that was used in the 1800s as a convict settlement. Some of the hardest criminals were sent to the peninsula, which consisted of multiple different buildings that today stand as mere ruins. Port Arthur is now a popular tourist site where people travel from all over the world to view the broken down buildings. Over 150 years later, the tourist town would become home to the worst massacre Australia would see to date. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the no notoriety pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story while remaining true to our pledge and not naming the shooter by their actual name. In today's episode, we will be referring to the shooter as Mark. On April 28, 1996, Mark was 28 years old and some would say had hit rock bottom. His best friend and girlfriend had died in a car crash, and he himself was injured in the crash and had spent quite some time in the hospital. He was living in a mansion he once shared with his prior girlfriend. Mark had a new girlfriend now, but he never seemed to be happy. He felt like the world was out to get him and thought of himself as a nobody. Mark left his mansion in Newtown, securing the electronic alarm at 9:47 a.m. He had a green duffel bag with him that he had stashed 3 firearms in, as well as 2 sets of handcuffs, ammunition, a sash cord rope, and a hunting knife inside. In the trunk of his yellow Volvo station wagon, he had several cans of gas as well as additional guns and ammunition. He also had a surfboard affixed to the roof of the vehicle. He waved goodbye to his girlfriend, who was a bit confused since she had never known Mark to be a surfer, but he said that he was going to be going to Roaring Beach to catch some of the waves. Instead, Mark drove to a bed and breakfast located near the water on the Tasman Peninsula. He nonchalantly walked through the front door of the guest house and immediately opened fire, killing Nolene Martin, who went by Sally. When her husband, David Martin, came out to the front desk to see what all the commotion was about, Mark shot him dead too. Mark then took the keys to the guest house, locked the front door, and walked back to his vehicle and began driving toward the Port Arthur historic site. It only took him about 15 minutes to drive from the Seascape guest house to the historical site. Mark was stopped by a man named Ian Kingston, who was helping direct the never-ending stream of traffic that was approaching the site. Port Arthur was a large tourist attraction, and especially on the weekends had a lot of traffic coming in and out, both on foot and car traffic. Mark approached Ian in his yellow Volvo and asked Ian if he could park down near the Broad Arrow Cafe. Ian told him he couldn't park there and he would have to go to the main parking lot area. Mark thanked him and continued driving while Ian went back to assist the tourists. Out of the corner of Ian's eye, he saw Mark parking in the exact spot where minutes prior he told Mark he couldn't park. However, it wasn't worth the hassle for Ian to go and speak with Mark about moving his vehicle, as he had enough on his plate at the moment.
It became obvious by about 11 that it was going to be more busier than what they predicted. I think we had 14 coaches end up coming in. Car parking was getting a bit of an issue because visitor centres there now wasn't there in those days. Everyone used to park under the oak trees and, it was really limited. Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured. When he drove in on the day, he wanted to park down near the jetty, and I pointed out to him that he couldn't do that because there was already about 8 coaches there. So he said, can I park in front of the information centre? And I said, well, it's better if you park along under the trees, under the oak trees. You want to get on the 1:30 ferry. And I said, well, you'll have to get a boarding pass from the information centre. He tried to get on the boat, couldn't get on. So he got back in the car and went and parked down in amongst all the coaches where we didn't want him to park anyway. I watched him do that. He sat there for half a minute. He got out of his car. On the back seat of his car he had a golf bag type of thing, a big bag. I saw that as he drove in. Anyway, he mucked around the back seat, got this bag out, put it on his shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really take a lot of notice of it. Then he went in the boot and he was mucking around in the boot of the car. That took him a couple of minutes, fiddling there, doing whatever he had to do. Then he walked up to the cafe.
Ian saw Mark start walking towards the cafe as he went back to his own work. Carrying the duffel bag, Mark walked into the Broad Arrow Cafe. He immediately noticed all of the people inside. The restaurant was quite small, and the 60 or so people that were packed inside made it appear even smaller. In addition to the restaurant, there was also a gift shop inside the cafe. Mark was hungry and wanted something to eat. He walked up to the counter and ordered some lunch. After his lunch was ready, he took his lunch tray and duffel bag and walked to a table just outside the doors of the restaurant. He struck up a conversation with a person at a table nearby and casually asked the customer if he had noticed all the yellow jacket wasps in the area. After he finished his lunch, Mark walked to the back of the restaurant and was seen putting a video camera on an empty table. Within seconds, Mark took out a rifle, specifically a Colt AR-15 SP1 carbine, and opened fire. He was fire at random, without any aim whatsoever. Within 15 seconds, Mark had fired 17 shots, instantly killing 12 people. He started walking around the cafe, firing an additional 12 shots, killing 8 more, and wounding several others. Then he reloaded his weapon and walked out of the cafe towards his waiting vehicle, all while firing at people who were now fleeing the scene after hearing gunshots. Along the way, he managed to kill an additional 4 innocent people. Meanwhile, Ian had heard several loud banging and popping noises. He ran to the cafe to see what the ruckus was, thinking it was an electrical fire. Once he got to the cafe, he walked into complete carnage. All he saw were bodies and blood. Ian didn't even know where to start. Mark didn't drive very far before he took the lives of his next victims. Nanette Macaque was fleeing the deadly massacre with her 2 daughters, 3-year-old Madeline, 6-year-old Alana. Mark drove just under 1,000 feet, where he parked his vehicle on the side of the road and got out. While Nanette was on her knees, she was begging Mark to please don't hurt her babies. He fired 2 shots toward Nanette, Madeline, and Alana. 1 shot hit Nanette, and the other shot hit 3-year-old Madeline. Alana, knowing that her life was now in danger, took off running. Mark hunted her down and fired 1 shot at the 6-year-old Alana, killing her instantly as she hid behind a tree. He nonchalantly walked back to his vehicle and drove away.
The Macaques, they wanted to go home, and that was where we lost them. They just veered off and unfortunately went the wrong way.
How dare someone murder 2 little kids after murdering their mother and chase one of them round a tree to kill her? It just beggars belief.
Shortly down the road, Mark saw a gold BMW parked on the side of the road with 4 people inside the car. Mark proceeded to park his vehicle, get out, and walk over to the BMW. He shot all 4 of the occupants, dragged their bodies out into the road, and stole their car, abandoning his Volvo. He continued driving until he saw a white Toyota. There were 2 people in the vehicle. The passenger was a male and the driver was a female. He ordered the man out of the car and into the trunk of the stolen BMW. Mark went back to the Toyota and fired 2 shots into the windshield on the driver's side, killing the women instantly. After Mark had finished his mission at Port Arthur, he drove the BMW to the Seascape Bed and Breakfast. However, his actions had escalated as he now had a hostage. Mark proceeded to light the vehicle on fire, and then he and the hostage went inside the bed and breakfast. Once inside, Mark called 000, which is equivalent to 911 in the United States, to report the vehicle fire. Investigators believe that Mark reported the vehicle fire in an attempt to lure police to the house so he could shoot them one by one as they approached the bed and breakfast. As the police officers started showing up, Mark started shooting at the officers from inside the guest house. Luckily, no officers were shot. This included police officers, detectives, as well as police tactical group or SWAT team. Not long after, the negotiators were called in to help with the scene.
Have you done any training to become a pilot?
No.
I'm sorry?
You can buy a helicopter. I've got the money. Don't you understand? I've got the money. I've got all the wealth I want.
All right.
Right?
Okay.
What's the time now?
Terry McCarthy was one of the negotiators who appeared to help lure the gunmen out of the guest house. Terry knew that Mark was talking to him on a cell phone, and Terry knew that cell phone batteries would eventually die.
What we weren't aware of at that particular time was that the only phone within the Seascape property was a battery-operated cordless phone. We were aware that he was using that phone, but we didn't have the knowledge that there wasn't a backup landline phone that he could pick up in the event that that went flat. So that created some problems for us when, of course, it was apparent that the battery had gone flat. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get a telephone into a situation like that safely?
Mark continuously fed Terry lies, telling him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he had indeed been surfing. Mark also told him that he had multiple hostages and was fixing them food. At some point during the conversation, Mark had fired a single shot and killed the hostage inside the guest house. After many hours, Mark's cell phone battery died, just as the negotiators feared.
The way he spoke was more like a young teenager rather than an adult male. He was telling us stuff that was completely false. He said he'd been out surfing or something like that, and it was complete nonsense. So there wasn't anything useful happening in that communication.
We didn't establish that rapport because there was no rapport to establish. He was in denial as to what had occurred in terms of he wasn't even making reference to what had occurred at the historic site. He was talking about some fanciful event that he claimed had occurred at another location at Fortescue Bay, which is also on the peninsula.
After 18 long and grueling hours, Mark lit the guest house on fire and attempted to flee the burning building. Not long after he had exited the building, likely by climbing out of a window, he was apprehended. When police apprehended him, he was on fire and screaming. After putting the fire out on his person, he was taken to the Royal Hobart Hospital and was put under strict surveillance to make sure he didn't leave the hospital. He was treated for severe burns on his back and buttocks. On April 30th, 1996, Mark was charged with his first of many murder counts. He also had his first hearing on this date via video from his hospital bed. There were many lives affected that day. 35 people lost their lives, ranging in age from 3 years old to 72 years old, and additionally, 23 people were injured. To this day, the massacre is still the worst massacre in Australian history. Because of time constraints, we can't tell every victim's story. However, there is a link in the show notes that you can click, and it will take you to a document where you can read about each of the victims. Jason Bernard Winter was a 23-year-old man who was killed by gunshots to his hand, neck, chest, and head. Jason had sought cover while the massacre was taking place. Once he thought the shooter had left, he came out of hiding and ran right into Mark, who then proceeded to shoot and kill him. Tony Kiston was a 51-year-old man who was visiting the Broad Arrow Cafe with his wife. When Mark first entered the cafe and opened fire, Tony selflessly pushed his wife under a table and sacrificed himself. His wife's life was spared, but Tony would lose his because of a single gunshot wound to his head. Carolyn Lofton was at the cafe having lunch with her 15-year-old daughter, Sarah, when Mark opened fire. Carolyn's life was saved. However, her daughter Sarah died from a single gunshot to the head. As mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Port Arthur is a historical site with a very interesting past. It started as a timber station in 1830 and a convict settlement. Port Arthur is where some of the harshest criminals were sent and was known for having very strict security measures. Food was used as both a reward and a punishment. Guards would reward convicts with larger portions of food, tea, sugar, and sometimes even tobacco. Food was also used as harsh punishment, If you needed punishing, you were only given the bare minimum of bread and